while concrete data is limited, we know that COVID-19 disproportionately affects vulnerable populations. The Center for Disease Control shows that Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the United States experience higher rates of COVID-19 related hospitalizations and death when compared with white populations. And the disproportionate impacts don't stop there. In 2021, the National Council for Disability released a report titled "The Impact of COVID-19 on People with Disabilities," and the findings weren't surprising. NCD found that COVID-19 exacted a steep toll on the disabled community. Perhaps most poignant of all, the NDC found that students with disabilities were effectively cut off from their educational institutions. And the University of Washington exemplifies this finding. Disability resource services at every single University of Washington campus are not only out of legal compliance, but struggling to stay afloat. This is compounded when UW policy for any student who tests positive for COVID-19 are directed to DRS to submit a case. As such, disabled students who were already struggling to get foundational accommodations are left further and further behind, leading to a growing dropout rate for disabled students on campus. And it's this point that leads me to urge the consideration of 3 lessons the university should learn from the pandemic. First, accessibility is the key to an inclusive educational experience for all. Second, true change comes from equitable community partnerships, not top-down policies. And third, decisions that concern students must involve students. So first, accessibility is the key to an inclusive educational experience for all. Now, at a legal level, we know this to be true. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1963 and Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 prohibit discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, and sex. The ADA of 1990, in conjunction with Section 504 of the Rehab Act of 1973, was meant to eradicate discrimination against disabled students. So what happened? Why are so many of our current UW students under-resourced, under-supported, and underrepresented? Because the law on the books is not the same as law in reality. You see, as of right now, UW operates to meet the bare minimum. But recognizing that accessibility is the key to an inclusive educational experience and environment would ensure that UW does not only attempt to meet the bar, but devote resources, support, and representation to exceeding it. For example, first steps of tangible accessibility policies can be the devotion of funds to disability resources and technology. Currently, DRS at UW Seattle has less than 10 positions. Less than 10 positions at a school where 15% of the student body, over 7,000 students, identify as disabled. Even funding 10 more positions would enable ratios of accommodation case managers to dramatically decrease, allowing students to not only receive personalized care, but care at all. Moreover, UW can look towards funding Panopto and LectureCap technologies in all classrooms to ensure that lectures are offered in a hybrid manner and accessible to not only disabled students, but all non-traditional students, including international and commuter students who are continually subjected to barriers when attempting to get to physical campus. Now, I recognize that it's important to be practical, which is why funding mechanisms for projects should be considered. There are currently multiple committees on campus, such as the Student Technology Fee, who, since the pandemic, have built up reserves of over $10 million. And such committees, in conjunction with UW officials, have the ability to create university directives that would mitigate inaccessibility on campus. Secondly, we must recognize that true change comes from equitable community partnerships, not top-down policies. But what does that mean? It means honoring the capacity of your partner or your collaborator while considering your own positionality in the partnership. You see, top-down policies are indicative of institutional operations, but that doesn't mean equity has to be excluded from the conversation. For example, after spring break, the University of Washington released a campus-wide email that communicated masks, while encouraged, were not to be enforced anymore. The decision was made in collaboration with King County public health officials and university stakeholders, such as President Anna Marie Kause and other regents sitting at the top. There was no consultation with disability resources or centers, or other marginalized students and community groups. The decision to not enforce masks was not only detrimental to vulnerable students, but deadly. And this top-down policy paralleled the decision made by university officials to return to largely in-person operations at the beginning of spring quarter. Such decisions not only ignore students' demands for accessible learning, but invalidate them. The implementation of equitable community partnerships would mean the university worked alongside community members, disability centers and advisors, and other vulnerable and marginalized individuals to make communal decisions. And it means those decisions would be equitable, such as continuing to push for mask mandates because disabled and chronically ill students are adversely affected by looser restrictions. Another example of an equitable policy would be the continuation of hybrid learning, not only for disabled students who are too afraid to risk COVID-19 exposures on campus, but also takes into consideration the experience of commuter, international, and parent students. Which brings me to the third lesson that UW can learn in a post-pandemic era. Decisions that concern students must involve students. Combined with lesson 1 regarding accessibility and lesson 2 of equity, lesson 3 presents us with a new reality post-pandemic. It presents us with a university where students are directly involved in decisions made about their education. No, I'm not naive. I know that bureaucratic functionality does not always pave the way for the involvement of tens of thousands of students like we have at UW. But that doesn't mean students should be completely absent from the picture. Short term, this could look like creating more spaces for students to voice their opinions, and ensuring that these spaces are not only accessible physically, such as scent-free, wheelchair-accessible spaces, but also metaphorically, creating spaces that are BIPOC friendly, that are community-oriented, and that prioritize student voices too often ignored. Tangibly, this could take the form of university student roundtables, where bi-monthly, students across different campuses representing different identities and groups have the ability to speak with individuals who often create those top-down policies we were just talking about. The facilitation of these spaces could be led by those very students and create productive policies that are not only informed by student voices, but crafted by the very students they will affect. From increasing accessibility, to prioritizing equitable partnerships, to amplifying student voices, each lesson feeds into tangible change at the university level, such as reinstituting mask recommendations, encouraging hybrid lectures, and creating student stakeholder roundtables. But the change wouldn't stop there. We could see change at a macro level. Increased public health safety, accessibility, and involvement encourages greater engagement of students in classrooms, and therefore, increased engagement with the community. Instead of bounding students by inaccessible and inequitable practices, we have the opportunity to live up to the University of Washington's motto. If we take these lessons for what they're worth, we can truly be boundless.